Hey, welcome back! Today we're looking at Shakespeare's Henry VI Part 2. As a history play, this one isn't often read except for by big Shakespeare fans, but it's so fantastic and so much fun. There's lots of really great stuff in it. There are some challenges to reading it, like the fact that there are many characters. I think that this has more characters than any other Shakespeare play, but the majority of those are kind of bit parts. So if you can get past that, the play is so worth reading. Last time looking at Henry VI Part 1, we noted how the kingdom was becoming more and more divided, thanks to the self-interest of all of its leaders. We lost big portions of France because of Joan of Arc, but also because of the infighting between York and Somerset, and between Gloucester and Cardinal Winchester. This play is going to pick back up right where the last one left off, and continue those tensions. So at the very end of the play, we saw that Suffolk had won over Margaret, and was giving her to King Henry to be his new bride. And he was doing that for two reasons. One, because he basically found her very attractive. And two, because if the queen is his new girlfriend, then he'll have influence over the king and over the kingdom, and he'll rule the world. And so in part 2, we pick back up with the wedding. Here's Henry and Margaret just about to be married, and we can already tell that things are going to go badly. Before I get into a summary of what happens in this play, let's talk about some of the big themes and cool ideas about it. In the last play, we saw the death of heroes, and so most of the really good, strong characters who cared about the nation have died out. There are still characters who do care about the fate of England, but even these characters are caught up in power struggles that are not going to end well. So one great tension within this play is the difference between decisions made in self-interest as a leader versus decisions for the good of your state or your nation. And with all these characters who have their own personal agendas and have their own personal desires, that's ultimately going to cause England to suffer and to fall apart. We're heading straight into civil war by the end of this play. Another interesting tension within this play is the tension between justice and religion. You'd think that if you are a moral, good person, you would be more just. But the most ostensibly religious character in this play, Henry IV, does a whole lot of simpering and talking about religion while showing no real strength of character. Instead, he uses his religion as an excuse to avoid making action, and to avoid feeling guilty for the actions that other people push him into. Justice, on the other hand, is hard to find when characters are so interested in their own agendas. The main character who really sort of embodies justice within this play is Gloucester. Gloucester begins the play as the protector of the nation, the one who has been charged with really ruling while Henry VI grew up. He seems to care about justice for the common people, as opposed to simply justice for the lords and ladies. He also believes in due process of law, that if you just trust the legal system, everything will work out for the good. Do the right thing, trust the legal system, everything will work out. That's really great until the legal system is being controlled by power-hungry, self-interested jerks. So we'll see how that idea plays out in the play. Finally, there's a really fascinating diversity within Henry VI Part 2. Some of the most fascinating and driving characters in this play are women. Margaret is going to pull lots of strings, and Eleanor is going to try to. We also have the commons, the common people, the peasants, who are struggling for justice within this play, and the tension between them and the nobles is complicated and layered. So let's unpack the action in this play. Starting in Act 1, we have the wedding scene, and here's Margaret brought in by Suffolk, the little rat, who presents her before the king. The two of them are about to be happily married, and Gloucester reads the articles to discover what her dowry is. If you finished Henry VI Part 1, you realize that her dowry is nothing. In fact, England had to hand over two huge sections of France. And so instead of gaining more strength in France, they actually lose some of their strongest holds. And from here on out, basically France is lost. Sure, we still have Normandy and Brittany, but those are falling fast. Okay, there are a lot of characters in this first scene, and establishing these tensions, first off, makes the rest of the play much more clear. Basically, there's a sequence of different characters going over in the corner and plotting against other characters in this scene. Starting at the beginning, we have Henry IV, who is the king, but is the least aware person in this play. He completely just kind of goes with what everybody else is saying and doing, and he never has any real influence. We have Margaret and Suffolk, and Margaret is here to pull the strings of Henry for Suffolk. Suffolk is supposedly supporting Henry, but really he's just trying to gain power for himself. Next, we have Gloucester. Now, Gloucester is the protector for the throne, as I've said. He's supposed to be the one who's really ruling the nation right now until Henry takes back his rulership. And as we said before, he's interested in justice and in keeping everything in order. Of the lords, he's the only one who seems to have England in mind. If we remember in the last play, Gloucester and the Cardinal Winchester had a lot of animosity. Winchester hates Gloucester, and Gloucester returns the hatred. Gloucester is horrified by basically the huge losses that are just handed over in France, and he's mortified by Suffolk's decision here. So our next group of characters is Cardinal Winchester with his cronies Somerset and Buckingham. So after Gloucester leaves, the Cardinal Winchester begins to use this as an excuse to badmouth Gloucester and to plot against him. Their team anti-Gloucester. The next group is Salisbury and Warwick. They're also heartbroken to hear that they've just handed over Maine and Anjou to France, especially because it was their hard work and fighting and blood and sweat and tears that won those places in the first place. And so just to give it back to France so we can get this stupid queen? So they're mortified with Suffolk's decision, and they also don't trust Cardinal Winchester. So to some extent, they are on the side of Gloucester, because to some extent, they are on the side of England as they see it. That's going to be complicated later. Finally, there's Richard, Duke of York, formerly Richard Plantagenet. We saw him as an important character in the last play, and it was his rivalry with Somerset that caused lots of problems in France. Okay, so Richard, Duke of York, or York, has his own personal plot, and he believes that he is the rightful heir to the throne. And so he is ready to take over Henry VI's place. But he has to have all of his cards laid out right. He also sounds like he's supporting Gloucester because he's fighting against Somerset, who's teamed up with Cardinal Winchester. But he has his own personal agenda. Yeesh. In recap, Henry IV, he's just there. Queen Margaret, Suffolk, Cardinal Winchester, Buckingham, and Somerset are all on a team against Gloucester. Meanwhile, Warwick and Salisbury are against the Cardinal and all his cronies, and York is doing his own sort of manipulative game where he might be on anybody's side, but really he's on nobody's side. He's on York's side. Whew! As the act continues, we meet Eleanor, or Nell, Gloucester's lovely wife, who is a firecracker. She's all kinds of ambitious a la Lady Macbeth. And since Gloucester is the next in line for the throne if something were to happen to Henry VI, she's almost like, why aren't we in power? Why am I not the queen? She has ambition and pride issues. Gloucester, on the other hand, has none. He completely supports Henry VI, he supports the nation, he supports justice. He's gonna do the right thing. And so he gets onto his wife a little bit for being so excessively ambitious. The problem is, Eleanor's decided to take things into her own hands. And so she's gotten involved with Sir John Hum, who's dabbling in dark magic to help her in her quest to overthrow her enemies and really gain more power. Turns out it's actually a trap, as Sir John Hum mentions in a soliloquy, because it's Buckingham and the Cardinal and others like that who are paying him to lead her into her own demise. Bum bum bum. Next we have a scene where the common people are bringing their petitions for Gloucester, but unfortunately they run into Suffolk instead. Suffolk is hanging out with the Queen because they're totally an item, and he listens to 3 of these petitions, all of which are against powerful people. One is against the Cardinal, one is against him, oops, and one is against York. Margaret tears up the 2 that are for their cronies and throws them back in their face. But they're interested in a petition that paints York in a bad light. Because right now, The king is trying to decide whether he should put Somerset as regent of France or York. York used to be regent of France, so he seems fully qualified, but Somerset is more one of the buddies of Suffolk and Margaret, etc. So in the midst of this decision, where Gloucester actually backs York, Suffolk uses the petition of Peter, the apprentice, who is charging his master with claiming that York was the true heir to the throne, which makes York sound a little bit like a traitor. Gloucester administers justice between the two of them. There's evidence on both sides, and so they're going to do a duel to see who's the right, and Somerset gets to be regent. Meanwhile, in the midst of this, we have this tension between Margaret and Eleanor. Margaret hates Eleanor because Eleanor is super pretentious and thinks she's better than little lowly Margaret, even though Margaret is a queen now. But Margaret comes from nothing and basically cost them France, and so Eleanor snubs her nose at Margaret. There's this wonderful kerfluffle in the middle of this scene in which Margaret manages to accidentally slap Eleanor. Eleanor can do nothing about it except for storm off in a rage. And of course this pushes her more into the trap that's been set for her. In fact, in the very next scene, Eleanor is watching as a witch and some conjurers pull up a spirit to tell what's going to happen to all of her enemies. She's caught right in the middle of this and arrested by Buckingham and Somerset. Now all that crew have something against the straight-laced and noble Gloucester. We begin Act 2, where Henry and Margaret are off hunting with several other people, including the Cardinal and Gloucester. And the Cardinal and Gloucester are staring daggers at each other and whispering words of hatred back and forth throughout this whole scene. In fact, it gets to the point where the Cardinal and Gloucester plan to have a duel later on. And they're like, no, Henry, we're fine. In the midst of this, suddenly, there is a miracle announced. Someone was cured of blindness. And the man is brought before the king, and the king is like, oh, good, holiness brings wonderful miracles. But the miracle's actually a scam, and Gloucester, using his clever analysis of the situation, recognizes that this man was just shamming blindness in the first place. And he's also shamming lameness. And after uncovering all of this, Gloucester administers justice against this sham artist. And the king's appreciation of this holy miracle falls apart. But just as Gloucester is demonstrating how good his sense of justice and perception are, in comes Buckingham to say, oh, Eleanor was caught cavorting with witches. Gloucester is devastated, so much so that as Cardinal bumps him and reminds him of their duel, he of course is not going to duel with the Cardinal. And they all return with Gloucester heavily shamed. Cut to York's claim to the throne. Basically, going back in time, Edward II had 7 sons. From the first son's line came Richard II, but then he died and his line is cut off. From the second son, his line is cut off. The third son, ultimately, through several different connections, including a mother, a grandmother, etc., the Mortimer line connected with the York line, and that led to Richard, Duke of York. Therefore, he has a claim to the throne, because he's the most immediate to the throne by this line. Henry's claim is from the 4th son. So, step down, Henry. York is telling this to Warwick and Salisbury, who, after hearing the evidence, say, yep, we're totally on your side. Because they want to support England and the most immediate to the throne. Of course, they're just being used by York, but they care about England. Scene 3, we have the trial of Eleanor, which is heartbreaking for Gloucester. And he has this devastating moment where he watches his wife condemned. He will not speak up for her, though, because he believes in the law and in doing what's right. And she deserves justice for her sins, therefore she must get justice. The witches and stuff are condemned to die, but Eleanor, because of her status, is instead condemned to walk around with a sign on her back and let everybody shame her, and then she is to be exiled to the island of Man. As soon as the trial is done, Gloucester gets further humiliated when Henry tells him he's no longer protector and takes the staff away from him. Henry tries to do it in a nice way because he really admires Gloucester, but obviously Gloucester, with a wife like that, isn't a good symbol for rulership here. Speaking of wives who are problematic, since we're in court anyway, we're going to go ahead and have that duel between that apprentice and master that we had earlier on a treacherous claim about York. Apprentice was terrified. He does not know how to fight. He's absolutely horrified here, and the armorer is gloating. The armorer is over there drinking to his victory before it even begins, and when the two of them get together, the fight is Kind of awful. A terrified man against a drunk man. In the end, Peter, by a stroke of luck and also by his master's incredible drunkenness, manages to win, and his master dies. And therefore, he is exonerated, which is a kind of justice. But Henry praises God and virtue for Peter's winning, whereas York nudges him and says, yeah, thank goodness your master was drunk. Justice versus holiness here. Act 2 ends with Gloucester watching his wife being paraded around, and he speaks to her, and he is so upset with her. But he holds fast to the belief that with good action and virtue and a faith in justice and a faith in the legal system, things can only go okay. He will not come to her rescue and rescue her from her shame because she deserved what she got. And so she's sent off into exile, whereas he is summoned to court. And so Act 3 begins with Henry surrounded by all the crew, and they're all bad-mouthing Gloucester, because Gloucester is running late, or at least he's not there yet. And they're all acting like he's such a horrible person, and they start to accuse him of really horrible crimes. When he shows up, they shout these accusations to his face, using the sins of his wife as sort of a stepping stone to accuse him of all kinds of treacherous, treasonous, awful things. Embezzlement, causing the downfall of France, etc. He's able to answer most of their complaints just straight on, and they don't have any clear evidence for anything, but they say, oh, we have even more weighty claims against you, so you need to be imprisoned until we try you. Henry doesn't believe a word of it, and he's going, hey guys, let's be nice to poor Gloucester, he's such a good guy. But after they shout at Gloucester for a little while, Henry capitulates, and he just gives in and says, okay, fine, we'll lock him up and have a trial. And so Gloucester is arrested and held by Suffolk and the Cardinal. It's always good when your worst enemy is holding you prisoner. Gloucester ends by saying, I am innocent, and my innocence will be proven through the justice of the system. The problem is the system is being controlled by very unjust and selfish people. And even Gloucester can see how things are going. And he holds out hope for Henry. And he says, if my death or my sacrifice could end all of this and make things good for you, Henry, I would gladly sacrifice myself. But I see my own destruction as just the first point in a much more disastrous unfolding of events. And oh look, very, very foreshadowing. Oh, by the way, in the middle of this scene, they get a message that things are not going well in Ireland, and so they need an army to march up there and settle things down. It'll be okay, but they just need some support. And York's like, give me an army and I'll do it. And so they hand York an army. After the king steps out of the room and Gloucester's been arrested, all the other characters plot together to kill Gloucester, because they can't let this thing go to trial or his innocence might be proved, because after all, he doesn't really have anything against him. But because he is next in line for the throne, he's a threat to all of them, and so therefore, for being a threat, on paper, he better die. So the Cardinal and Suffolk decide to do the killing. Scene 2 opens right after Suffolk has sent these murderers in to kill Gloucester, and he's going, all right, that worked out well. The king comes in to summon Gloucester to trial, and Suffolk goes up and says, oh, he's dead. I don't know what happened. However, moments later, Warwick and Salisbury rush in, and all the common people have risen up to demand justice for Gloucester. And Warwick and Salisbury, who are the ones who were more on Gloucester's side than anybody else, especially because they want to defend England as well, are very angry with Suffolk and the Cardinal, who they feel are responsible for this. There's a great post-mortem scene where they examine Gloucester's body and see that he's clearly been strangled, and so that puts all the guilt on Suffolk. The common people say, unless Suffolk was taken over, we're gonna riot. And Salisbury and Warwick are the go-betweens between the common people and the king. The king, again, as in every other scene in this play, hems and haws and doesn't want to do anything, but finally just gives in to the general outcry. And he exiles Suffolk. Suffolk must leave the country. Suffolk and Margaret are devastated. And after the king walks off the stage, the queen and her boyfriend Suffolk have this really touching, romantic, sappy goodbye sequence, which is all kinds of flowery declarations of love, and it almost sounds really sweet except for what awful people they are. Near, far, wherever you are, I believe that the heart will go on. Once more, open the door. Finally, as a last blow in this scene, a messenger rushes in and says, oh, by the way, the cardinal got really sick all of a sudden. He's like had a stroke. Or maybe just the guilt of having murdered Gloucester is finally caught up with him, and Suffolk has to run off into exile, and Margaret has to part with him. And you're here in my heart, and my heart will go on and on. The last scene of Act 3 is the cardinal dying in his bed, and all of them watch him die and go, wow, that was bad. He basically dies raving and cursing, and he's a cardinal, a religious person, and yet he's the most irreligious person in this whole thing. Again, the extremely religious King Henry tries to get him to, pray or seek God in the last moments, and he doesn't give any sign of acknowledgement to that. He dies and makes no sign. Oh, God forgive him. And Warwick says, so bad a death argues a monstrous life. It's brutal. Act 4 begins with Suffolk fighting pirates. Yeah. This play is so great. So Suffolk was heading for France, and he was hoping to, basically hole up in France and dream of Margaret, but he gets captured by pirates instead, and they drag him to the shore and are ready to decide whether to ransom him for money or just kill him. And Suffolk, being the haughty jerk that he is, talks about what obnoxious peasants they are. And there's a line which indicates that either the person who he's talking to used to be his servant, or maybe he's just like, I know your type, you peasanty scum. And they're like, nah, it's not worth it, just go ahead and kill him. And so they brutally murder him. I mean, Suffolk can't even be nice to peasants to save his life, especially when one of them is named Walter, which sounds a whole lot like Walter, which was the prophecy of how he would die, and he kind of knows it, and so he's scared, but he still can't be nice to peasants. And so they decapitate him and leave him there for the queen to ultimately hear about and find and bury. And the one gentleman that they let go goes ahead and carries it back to the queen, because he knows that the queen loved Suffolk. Aww. But Act 4 is mostly going to be a big mess. Hey, you remember how we handed York an army and he was going to go up to Ireland and settle things? Well, he also decided that it's getting close to time for his big power play, but first he would try out a little test run. So he prompts this peasant named Cade to get up a rebellion, and in the name of the Mortimers, which is how York claims his family line, to try to arouse the people. The majority of Act 4 is Cade's rebellion, in which Cade and all the peasants take over. In Scene 2, Cade explains his trumped up lineage that declares him the descendant of the Mortimers and therefore in line for the throne. And then the people rise and rally around him because, after all, they have not been given justice lately. We've seen the way that the lords have just spat on them and walked all over them, with the exception of Gloucester. And now Gloucester's dead, and so the people are rising up to put a stop to all this. The rebellion rises, and for the next basically 10 scenes, it gets more and more violent, with Cade leading the people towards London, overthrowing London, taking over. There's a lot of comedy in the way that the peasants speak and react to their situation, but it's also incredibly brutal. They make jokes about killing literate people and killing all the lawyers, all these people who have trampled them with these rules and these regulations that they can't make heads or tails of, showing again all the flaws in the justice system. In the midst of this, we get this great scene where Margaret is walking around cradling the head of Suffolk and crying over him, but she's carrying his head. And the king's there like, okay. Henry says, "How now, madam? Still lamenting and mourning for Suffolk's death? I fear me, love, that if I had been dead, thou wouldst not have mourned so much for me." No, she probably wouldn't have carried your severed head around and cried over it. That takes real love. Near, far, wherever you are, I believe. And Henry and Margaret can really do nothing against this rebellion, and so they wind up just having to run away and flee London, presumably with the head in tow, having a little tete-a-tete. Cade is brutal and kills a lot of people who don't deserve it, including impaling people's heads on stakes and making them kiss in awkward ways. When finally, after he's already taken London, Buckingham and Clifford go and confront Cade and his mob, and they, in the name of Henry V, ask the people to step down. Of course, the people love Henry V. That was their great hero king. And so they're like, oh yeah, sure. And they completely abandon Cade. Cade, seeing how he can do nothing against the rallying cry of Henry V, throws up his hands and runs away. The act comes to a close with him being killed in a garden as he's starving and searching for food by a random guy named Iden. Meanwhile, the king and queen are relieved that Cade's rebellion is over. Oh, wonderful. And just as they get that moment of relief, in comes a message saying, oh look, York is marching on us with his army. What? How dare York just march on in here and attack us? But York says, I'm doing it because Somerset is a traitor, and so I'm coming to apprehend him. Henry panics and quickly says, well, throw Somerset in jail and we'll send a message to York saying, please stop, we want peace. Act 5 begins, York arriving on the scene and Buckingham meeting him. And York says, here I am with my army, I want Somerset now. And Buckingham says, as soon as we heard, we threw him in prison, don't you worry, let's just be peaceful. And so they shake on it, on their honor, that Somerset is in jail. And so York dismisses his army for a moment, and he walks to see the king. But just as he's standing there talking with the king's like, why are you raising an army against me? And York says, no, it's not against you. It was just against Somerset, that traitor. And they said, but why an army? And he's like, well, I thought I might help with the Cade's rebellion and stuff too. So he has an excuse for having a big army to back him, but clearly he's not coming in peace. And just at that moment, Margaret and Somerset walk in, and Margaret's stirring things up again. Margaret! She's not gonna bow to anyone. She's Margaret. And so, since Somerset's not in jail, York's like, fine, since you all are betraying me, I'm going to turn around and state my claim. I claim that I am the rightful heir to the throne, and I'll fight you for it. Warwick and Salisbury jump to his side and say, yeah, he's the rightful heir to the throne, and so we'll fight you. So it's Warwick, Salisbury, and York against all of the Lancasters. It's the War of the Roses starting in earnest. York with his white roses and all of his buddies wearing their white roses, and on Henry's side, everybody's wearing the red rose. Somerset, Clifford, Buckingham, all ready to fight for his side. Scene 2 is the big battle scene, lots of fighting back and forth. York kills old Clifford. York's sons Richard and Edward are involved as well. They're part of the battle. And Richard, the hunchback, kills Somerset. Somerset dies by the son of York. We need to keep our eye on Richard the Hunchback. The battle is a disaster. Young Clifford finds his dead father and swears to fight another day. He doesn't continue fighting because he's gonna stir up some real mischief in the future. We'll see how that goes, I suppose. And Henry and Margaret have to flee. The play ends when we find that Salisbury, even though he's an old man, has apparently been holding his own in battle. And now we're together, now we're ready. York has stated his claim, we're lined up, we're ready to fight for those white roses, and they're gonna march on London. So we definitely end on a cliffhanger. We'll have to get to Henry VI Part 3 to find out what happens. Has justice died to selfishness? Sure seems like it. And Henry's holiness is mostly just a flabby excuse for indecision. Thanks for watching. You can click to subscribe or to watch one of the other videos. And I will see you next time when we look at Henry VI Part 3. Bye-bye!